Hi, I'm Richard Moss.
And I'm Ryan Sipe, and we're with Edwards-Pitman. We're here to talk about our work at the Big Indian Creek site in Houston County, Georgia.
At the outset, we want to thank SGA President Casey Jones for inviting us to speak at the virtual fall meeting.
Also, we'd like to thank the members of the Ocmulgee Archaeological Society, several of whom volunteered during the excavations at the site.
Site 9HT-249 is located in the upper coastal plain about 65 kilometers below the fall line. It is on the north side of Big Indian Creek in the Lower Ocmulgee River drainage basin. The site was discovered in 2015 when Edwards-Pitman did a survey for a proposed Georgia Department of Transportation bridge replacement. A data recovery plan was developed for mitigation. Then we excavated in 2017 and 2018, and the Phase 3 report went final earlier this year. It's a multi-component site, but today we want to talk primarily about what the results of excavations at 9HT-249 can tell us about the Middle Archaic in this region. The site nature and the setting shaped our particular approach to the data recovery.
The Big Indian Creek site is in a region where we know coastal plain chert can be found relatively abundantly thanks to the underlying geology. The chert is typically found as cobble strewn in eroded upland areas or possibly along stream banks. The overwhelming majority of the 35,000 artifacts recovered at the site were debitage and tools made from locally available material. Although the overall range over which the material was sourced is difficult to determine because similar cherts stretch southwest to Alabama and northeast into South Carolina. A minority of artifacts found were also made from rocks of Piedmont origin, which came from above the fall line.
Another bit of context is that the site is buried in a broad, shallow sand dune. The sands graded through aeolian processes, so these are wind-blown sediment, probably during the Pleistocene or early Holocene. Within this dune, soil formation processes created distinct soil horizons, an A horizon at the surface, underlain by leached white E horizon, which underneath that is a B horizon where various dissolved minerals precipitated out, creating a stratum with mineral concretions. We anticipated that this sandy, acidic soil would be nearly devoid of organic preservation and consequently lack soil stain type features, and the on-site absence of clays and rocks also made large durable features like hearths unlikely. However, the hypothesized burial by wind-blown settlement boded well for preservation of some information about site structure regardless, in the form of distinctive variations in the horizontal and vertical artifact distribution. Optically stimulated luminescence staining was performed, which helped illustrate that indeed the sandy sediment in which this soil formed accumulated over time, beginning in this late Pleistocene to early Holocene time frame.
We knew going in, based on the Phase 2 results, that artifacts could be found throughout the upper meter of soil, but they tended to be clustered near the base of the stratum 2, some 60 to 80 centimeters below the surface. Most of the artifacts were debitage. The deeper B horizon, or stratum 3, was culturally sterile except for where intruded upon by root casts from stratum 2. With the expectation that there was very little potential for features, understanding the horizontal and vertical distribution of the mostly lithic artifacts was paramount.
We wanted to use data recovered from the site to study several subjects to the extent possible, including this particular subregion's cultural chronology, which is not as well defined as surrounding areas that have historically had more survey and excavation. Additionally, it was hoped much could be learned about the site's function and internal structure based on the horizontal patterning of artifacts. Also, there was some reasonable hope of inferring subsistence practices and other information about site activities from use-wear analysis of the lithics, which included not only debitage but numerous examples of utilized and broken tools. The portion of the site within the area of potential effect for the bridge construction was only a subset of the overall site, measuring approximately 170 meters by 75 meters. An existing highway runs through the site, so really the only areas subject to mitigation were these long, narrow swaths on either side of the road.
Our excavation strategy was first to get a decently high-resolution picture of artifact distribution across the entire impacted area within a 5-meter shovel testing grid. We determined that there were 5 main artifact concentrations, defined as areas where tests yielded 10 or more artifacts each. We named these loci 1 through 5, beginning in the southeast and going counterclockwise. 2 of these loci were east of the road, and 3 were to the west. Locus 3, the northernmost concentration on the west side of the road, was perhaps the most surprising, being found underneath the thick clay fill of the roadside embankment. These overall patterns were very intriguing. As a naive initial hypothesis, one might imagine these were potentially contemporaneous deposits of a single larger occupation, some sort of proto-village. However, the shovel testing did not provide much temporal information to refute or support such ideas, as it yielded primarily a homogeneous assemblage of mostly small, non-diagnostic coastal plain chert debitage.
In order to get more temporal information and a higher resolution view, it was necessary to obtain larger samples from each of these concentrations via block excavation. The blocks were comprised of hand-excavated 1 by 1 meter units excavated in 10 centimeter vertical levels. In choosing our block locations, each of the previously identified loci were targeted to obtain more temporally diagnostic artifacts. However, we didn't want to overly bias our sample to areas of only high artifact density, as these were evidently areas of intensive lithic reduction, and we had hopes of potentially finding interesting features or patterns in low-density areas as well. So we also decided to arrange excavation into a 90-meter-long mega trench on the east side of the road to maximize the recovery of information about site structure by sampling across highs and intervening lows.
Naturally, the block excavations yielded a lot more datable items, and of course the site proved to be thoroughly multi-component, everything from early Archaic to late woodland. Among the 35,000 artifacts recovered, there were something like 100 PPKs or PPK fragments, and among the more complete, the typable specimens, there were representatives of almost every pre-contact period. Early Archaic period types like Bolin beveled and Kirk corner-notched, Middle Archaic period types like Stanley and Brier Creek Lanceolate or Conerly, late Archaic period types like Savannah River and Marion, woodland types like Tallahassee, and some 25 sand grit tempered sherds, probably attributable to more than a couple woodland area pot breaks. Despite the expectation of little organic preservation, burnt remains like charred wood, charred nuts, and sooting on sherds were apparent exceptions, leading to a couple AMS radiocarbon dates. One sooted sherd from Locus 1 returned a calibrated 2 sigma date range in the late woodland between 684 and 876 AD. Charred nutshell of unidentified species was found in an artifact concentration near the base of Stratum 2 in Locus 2, adjacent to a Stanley PPK, which yielded a calibrated date range between 5351 and 5218 BC, or the early part of the Middle Archaic. From here on, we'll try to focus on the topic at hand, the Middle Archaic.
The Middle Archaic period points were the most numerous diagnostics at the Big Indian Creek site. The majority we typed as Brier Creek Lanceolate. This point is also sometimes called Conerly or Guilford stemmed. The examples here at 9HT249 have a range in characteristics, but all are made from coastal plain chert and are long lanceolate points with tapering stems with incurvate bases. Some had very narrow and thick blades. Some examples had bases that were so incurvate as to almost appear bifurcated, similar to the presumably earlier Stanley type. Others, especially those with wide blades and stronger shoulders, resembled late Archaic types like Savannah River stemmed. Yet their distinctive lanceolate blade shape compelled us to group them all together. There were also many broken Archaic points that could not be fully typed, but which appeared to have very similar bases. Also, there were many hafted scrapers with the same hafting element as the Brier Creek Lanceolate points, but these were reworked so that they were no longer points but scrapers, with a blunt business end perpendicular to the hafting.
Middle Archaic period types were not only frequent at 9HT249, they were also spatially circumscribed to just one portion of the overall site, which is perhaps the most significant discovery of the investigation. For now, due to the complicated multi-component nature of the site, this fact is mostly useful because it helps us filter the results that we are interested in, but there are other cultural and settlement implications regarding this pattern that will be mentioned briefly in the end. Here is a snapshot of the pattern. On the left are plotted all the Stanley and Brier Creek Lanceolate points. They consistently fall within concentrations called locus 2 or locus 3. Similar maps were made based on the diagnostics of other periods, and these were overlaid to produce the rather complicated map on the right. That shows a haphazard and overlapping distribution of artifacts related to the other site components.
To be clear, there is not a single pure Middle Archaic area of 9HT249, but vertical stratigraphy seems to be well preserved enough to sort out at least some of the horizontal overlap of early Archaic, Middle Archaic, and woodland in locus 2. For instance, in this profile drawing of a section of Block E, you can see that the locus 2 artifact concentration can be vertically separated into sparser upper layers that contain woodland diagnostics like a Tallahassee PPK and miscellaneous sherds, while the deeper portion of the concentration near the interface of strata 2 and strata 3 has mainly Middle Archaic period diagnostics like Brier Creek Lanceolate points. Also Stanley Peak PKs, although an early Archaic Kirk corner notch is also mixed in these same levels.
An analysis of post-depositional disturbances shows the separation of locus 2 east of the road and locus 3 west of the road is artificial. The map on the left analyzed how elevation changed when the road was built. Blue shaded areas on the east side of the road show cuts, while green shaded areas under the west of the road show fill. The void in artifact concentration separating loci 2 and 3 is simply where a portion of the site was dug up and pushed westward as fill during highway construction in the mid-20th century, resulting in a swatch of low counts on the east side and elevated counts and disturbances on the west side. Loci 1 and 5 may have similarly been previously united prior to the road. The graphic on the right in this slide helps illustrate an altogether different point. It's a two-dimensional profile view showing how the artifact density changes from south to north in the vicinity of the megatrench as distance increases from the creek. It is notable that locus 1, which is set on the edge of the trench, on the edge of the landform closer to the creek, has numerous spikes in the artifact density. Locus 1 is thoroughly multi-component with occupations dating to at least the early Archaic, late Archaic, and woodland. The spiky density seen across it is probably emblematic of incidentally overlapping lithic concentrations deposited by numerous cultures that temporarily used the lip of the landform because it was a nice campsite over a creek. In comparison, the undisturbed portions of locus 2 beyond the road cut, the profile of artifact density appears to rise and fall more gradually, and the distribution is set back much farther from the creek at the edge of the landform.
Hopefully the prior slides have convinced you of the Middle Archaic nature of loci 2 and 3. So moving forward in our remaining time, we'll summarize what kinds of activities are indicated for this component at 9HT249. Artifact types found in the Middle Archaic zones and indications of use wear on them is the primary data source. Perhaps most prominent is the high frequency of points and hafted scrapers appearing in this Middle Archaic zone, many of which exhibited extensive use wear and resharpening. This indicated that hunting, butchering, and hide preparation were important site activities.
Toolmaking activity is of course evident in the ample debitage which primarily consisted of small flakes, emblematic of late-stage reduction and resharpening. Although larger flakes, cores, and bifaces in earlier stages of reduction were found in lesser amounts. All staging of knapping occurred from cobble to finished tool. Interestingly and relatedly, there were also found features which consisted of various artifacts clustered together as though a former surface. One of these, feature 6, was at the epicenter of a high-density debitage area in Locus 2 and consisted of a collection of large chert cobbles clustered together. As mentioned previously, toolstone does not naturally occur at the site itself, but is locally available. So feature 6 suggests that the site inhabitants were collecting quality chunks of raw material and caching them on site for later use during tool production. Nearby, feature 7 is another cluster of artifacts which appears to be a toolkit of sorts and includes a Brier Creek Lanceolate point, along with other coastal plain chert bifaces and a quartzite cobble, presumably used as a hammerstone or percussion flaking tool, all lying together, seemingly in situ.
In addition, the charred nut fragments that were found in this zone may indicate exploitation of nut mast as a food resource for the site's inhabitants. A large Matate fragment was also found farther away in the low-density area between Locus 1 and Locus 2. Because of its position, we're not certain when it dates to, but it is consistent with grinding nuts for food production. It is also made from a large non-local imported stone, presumably from the Piedmont. If this was a seasonal campsite of highly mobile people, it would seem that items like the Matate and the previously mentioned cached chert cobbles may have become part of the site furniture that kept the site's Middle Archaic inhabitants coming back year after year.
Lastly, when red ochre was mapped across the site, it also mapped primarily to the Middle Archaic zone in loci 2 and 3. Ochre-like material may be naturally occurring at the site, as it appears to occur within the natural mineral concretions associated with stratum 3, the site's B horizon. But it occurred among the cultural deposits in stratum 2, primarily in the Middle Archaic zones of the site, suggesting that the site's inhabitants during this period knew about this material and were perhaps exploiting it for the manufacture of pigment. In fact, an alternative idea for the use of previously shown Matate fragment is pigment making, although if so, it was not evidently permanently stained.
What we believe we found at 9HT249 is evidence of a people with a consistent material culture tradition showing up in precisely the same location again and again. Presumably the site population at any given time was not exceedingly large, and so the amount and diversity of artifacts present represents repeated visits of considerable duration, and apparently not by mere coincidental reoccupation of a generally habitable landform, as I would argue is true of other periods, but deliberate revisits by people who may have stashed tools and raw materials there intentionally for later use. Perhaps they ranged widely and crossed to and fro the fall line, but were consistently coming back specifically to this location to avail themselves of some local resource like the local chert or perhaps hematite for making pigments.
The pattern of Middle Archaic occupation at 9HT249 was a surprising find. Oft repeated about the Middle Archaic settlement in Georgia's coastal plain in the regional archaeological literature is that it is seemingly rare. As survey data suggests, sites of this period are infrequent and overall population declined. I think 9HT249 may be either the exception that proves the rule, or perhaps it is part of an unrecognized or heretofore unintentionally suppressed pattern. Perhaps such sites on smaller tributaries and set back farther back from the water, going unrecognized in river-based surveys. Or deeply buried sites are too readily dismissed at the survey level as non-diagnostic scatters due to the intensive work required to find diagnostics on such sites. Or the vagaries of the projectile point typology and sequence may obfuscate their true prevalence frequency. Regardless, Hopefully work at 9HT 249 adds interesting data to this area of study.
We'd like to thank the GDOT project archaeologists Pamela Bachman and Cisco Williams. And we'd also like to thank John McBride and the Ocmulgee Archaeology Society volunteers and all of our helpers at Edwards-Pitman and other companies that participated in this investigation. And thank you again, Casey, for inviting us to speak at this year's SGA Fall 2021 meeting.
Thank you.